All right, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about cooperation and evolution and adaptation. Three things that interact in a couple of different causal directions. And I'm going to focus on this idea for cooperation called tag-mediated cooperation, which is a very, very simple mechanism by which agents can recognize each other and decide whether or not they want to cooperate or interact altruistically with each other. Okay? And there's two kinds of examples I'm going to talk about. These simple sort of game theory agents that are very abstract and play this very simple game. And that's the framework in which tag-mediated cooperation is introduced. And then in physically simulated agents in 3D virtual worlds. And that's where the cool videos are. Okay, that's what that symbol means. And so what I'm going to try and do is go through the rest pretty quickly so we can get to the cool videos. But in fact, there are about 3 talks worth of stuff in there, so I'll go sort of fast in some ways. Here's a little context where I'm coming from. This is Hampshire College, way out west there. And I don't know how many of you see the Jared's rooms yet, but this is a slide that if the people at Hampshire saw that I did that, they would be very angry because they try very hard to not be associated with this Saturday Night Live skit. Jordan, you look mystified. You never saw it. There's a skit on Saturday Night Live where Jimmy Fallon is this guy named Jared who's talking from a dorm room at Hampshire College, and he's got his webcam, and they're always figuring out ways to make. Actually, they have some AI content in there occasionally, but it always involves bombs. So, anyway, Hampshire's a very odd place in mostly positive ways. Undergraduate only. It's part of this 5-college consortium with UMass Amherst and Amherst College and Mount Holyoke and Smith. There's no grades, there's no credits, there's no majors, there's no departments. It's very sort of individual based. And one of the reasons I popped this up here is because if any of you are looking for a place like that, we're pretty unique and we do some pretty cool stuff. John can tell you all about it.
Yeah. Two thumbs up. My highest college rating.
Now, a little bit about my own personal context. I'm coming at this stuff from computer science. It's where my PhD is from, and I have a background in philosophy at the undergraduate level. And so the main thing I'm saying that for is as a disclaimer on the biology. As I've come to all the evolutionary biology and the evolutionary game theory and so on later on. My training is from computer science. Okay. So the core topic here is cooperation or altruism. You can think of altruism as one kind of cooperation where you cooperate in a way that is at least on the surface detrimental to you. You just do good for somebody else. And there are a bunch of questions about cooperation and evolution. One of them is how and when does it arise in an evolutionary process? So on a sort of first blush naive reading of Darwinian theory, you might expect it never to arise because, hey, the selfish guys are going to do better and so they're going to make more babies and so you're never going to get altruistic agents. People have understood for a long time now that that's not true because, well, there are a lot of different ideas for why and when it's not true. But one of them that's sort of obvious is that if you do acts of altruism towards others who are going to reciprocate and do acts of altruism to you, well, that could be adaptive. That could be a good thing. Another reason it can evolve comes from thinking about the gene's eye perspective, that if you share genes with somebody else, it's good for your genes sometimes for you to do altruistic acts towards them because collectively that will propagate more of your genes. Okay? So there's a long history, a long story there, and I'm going to touch on a couple pieces of it. But the thing that really excites me, and I'm trying to angle towards in this talk, is the other direction. How does the presence of altruism or cooperation change an evolving system? How does cooperation influence evolution? Okay? Not just how and when does evolution produce cooperation. So there's a feedback there that I think is really interesting and unexplored and practically useful if we can figure out how to harness it in A-life systems. Okay? So the first chunk here, before I even get to the game theory thing, I'm going to try and throw out some real big ideas, at least I think they're big, about these connections between evolution, adaptation, and cooperation. And one important perspective to start with, I think, is that adaptive complexity, that means complex evolved systems that solve problems in order to make it better in the world, are not really produced by individuals per se. They're produced by ecologies, by complex interacting systems, okay, with a lot of parts that interact with each other, not only in genetic ways. It's not just that the genes are being passed through these ecologies, but they're also what you could call economic relations. So you have genetic relations, but you also have resources that you share or trade. So in any active ecology, there's all sorts of nutrients being passed around and sort of bargains being struck all over the place. Okay? There's this web of genetic and ecological interactions. And many of those, in any natural ecosystem, involve things that are cooperative in one way or another. Okay? And so cooperation is sort of there in all natural ecologies that produce complex adaptive behavior. Now, some people have theorized that this is not an accident, and it's really critical to get higher levels of adaptive complexity that you have really essentially cooperative interactions. Okay? So here's a quote from Michaud. We see the formation of cooperative interactions among lower level individuals as a necessary step in evolutionary transitions. Only cooperation transfers fitness from the lower levels, cost to group members, to higher levels, benefits to the group. Right? So the idea here is that it's only by the little simple things interacting in a cooperative way that you get higher levels of complexity. Okay? It's only that way that you get what he's calling evolutionary transitions. And by that you can think of transitions to multicellularity, sexual reproduction, group life, social interactions, and so on. And the thesis here is that cooperation between the simpler guys is what builds the higher level complexity. Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan wrote, among the most successful, that is, abundant living beings on the planet are the ones that have teamed up. So Lynn Margulis is famous for having, at UMass Amherst, by the way, is famous for having pioneered the theory that higher levels of complexity in life arose from symbiogenesis, from symbioses between simpler organisms. So that we have a symbiosis between the mitochondria, who were free living organisms before they invaded other cells, and they formed a symbiosis, and then you got more complex cells. So foundations of life as we now know. Okay? This is controversial. Lynn Margulis's career, pushing to this point, has been very controversial. And here is a sort of nasty quote in this wonderful book, by the way, by John Maynard Smith. Yours says Mary. Anybody know how to pronounce his name? Sadner. Okay. They have this wonderful book about origins of life, and it's a very concise description of evolutionary transitions and what are the going theories for how each one happened and why and when. Anyway, they take a shot at Margulis here. Lynn Margulis marshaled the evidence that persuaded biologists that mitochondria and chloroplasts were once symbionts, has sometimes argued that symbiosis is the main source of evolutionary novelty. This will not do. Okay? Very stern sort of ruling there.
Yeah, you missed our previous discussion, the last session that we had, and that the whole question was, what is the main driving source of evolution? And we did not resolve it.
No Nobel
When
Prize
you do,
here.
let me know. I would say that what I want to say here is that it seems to be important, not that it's the main force, but that it is a force and that it has some interesting complexity and maybe has some interesting angles that haven't been exploited. And so with that, I want to try and think about why it could be important. And here I've taken an idea, or the term at least, from a wonderful book by John Holland called Hidden Order, which is a book about largely about his ecosystem. But he, in that book, does some really sort of pie-in-the-sky theorizing about complex adaptive systems and what are their important properties and how do they relate to each other. And one of the ideas that he has in there that he says is really critical for living systems and for any complex adaptive system is flows, resource flows of various kinds. Okay? So the thesis I want to put out there is that maybe the reason cooperation seems to play the role that some of these evolutionary theorists say it does in building up complexity in life is that cooperation produces resource flows. Okay? If you're cooperating, you're trading stuff around. If there's a lot of cooperation going on around, a lot of stuff is moving. And that in itself may be a necessary foundation for the emergence of higher levels of adaptive complexity. Okay?
Because that certainly works in economies. Economies that are trading a lot of things end up being rich economies.
Right. And all sorts of opportunities present themselves, and then some can be selected, and some. If you don't have the flows, there's nothing to get. Right? So, I think that's a sort of straightforward idea, but then it remains to sort of try and flesh it out and see how and when it works. Okay? But the idea is that cooperation, or the conditions that permit it, contribute to the evolution of adaptive complexity. And see if we can make that happen. Yeah.
So is this kind of flow sort of thing that define cooperation itself, or the cooperation does not involve flows?
I think all cooperation would involve flows. I think, in my reading
is
of
there like a more specific way or a conceptual way to kind of restate the essence of cooperation?
Well, I think a flow is a more general idea. So cooperation is causing things to move around, but things could move around without cooperation. They could move around with coercion. Right?
Flow is a motion of resources?
Yeah, resources, and often there's exchanges. So one resource goes that way and a different one comes this way. Yeah, sure.
On your last slide, I tried in mind experiment, I replaced cooperation with the word pipes. Pipes, you know.
Okay, well that's the more general idea of flows, but I guess what I'm saying is more...
Pipes are critical properties.
Yeah.
Wires and pipes, right? And pipes, or at least the conditions that permit pipes may contribute.
Yeah, well that's true, but I'm saying this is more specific. Because a pipe, you can force stuff through a pipe. Cooperation is there's a pipe and you're letting stuff go through.
It's possible that there could be an exchange.
Yes.
That the exchange could lead to cooperation because
both parties have a benefit
in their own interest to
yeah.
do that exchange. And if they don't, then the exchange doesn't happen.
Right.
You
well,
have
but
a choice.
Right, you have to have a choice. See, if you can make flows happen without having a choice if you have force, right?
Right.
If you say this guy's strong enough to suck all the energy out of everybody else. And that may produce short-term flows, maybe not long-term flows.
You know about Eric Bound's work also?
Who?
Eric Bound?
No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
So
he would argue in his system that you need to have conservation laws, right? That you can't just have flows that, sort of create an abundance of resources, that then cause agents to work in, illogical ways. So you have to also have some sort of resource conservation if you're going to have flows.
That's a good thing to think about. I think in a lot of the systems that we work with, it happens. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but there is conservation of energy. It's coming from sun or some feeders or something in this artificial world. And if it's being conserved, then things have to circulate. They can't just go.
So there's something moving from someplace to another, which is
right. So you can easily define software models where the two things flow together and then three copies can flow out.
I'm just saying the common notion of flow has conservation of mass kind of implicitly.
Yeah.
When you suggest flows, you think of like this area has something, but this area doesn't. So there's kind of like a resource gradient between the two. And then, given that there are pockets of haves and have-nots that are being kind of held in this gradient, it kind of goes on with that idea that heterogeneity is a more complex, more evolved thing. You know what I'm saying? Well, otherwise we're all just soup, and soup doesn't have flow, and that has like more entropy, right?
Right. Well, so there are membranes, right? There are things that stop flows, right?
Right.
And there's autonomy if they're individual agents. And so cooperation means you're intentionally, in some sense, letting stuff go that would be useful to you. If there were no boundaries and everything just followed gradients,
Right.
then I don't think you'd get complexity.
Do you want to pass?
Get spread. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about evolution of altruism in particular. I already mentioned there's long-standing debates about it. The ideas of why it evolves in certain situations that get the most attention are these. A lot of them have to do with that it's a gene's eye view, that you cooperate or donate to kin because they share your genes. That's a very fruitful perspective. It shows numerically why social insects donate, how much they do, and seem to act altruistically in certain ways. How many of their fellows they'll sacrifice themselves for. There are all these wonderful, actually numeric predictions you can make, and they all seem to work out very well. But there are other cases, especially with humans, where it's something higher level seems to be going on, and there are these ideas about reciprocation and about reputations. So in other words, if I think that John is generally somebody who donates to somebody when they're in need, and I see him in need, I can give him some, because even though if he's never given anything to me, he has a good reputation. And so there are papers that look at that and look at quantitative knowledge. But this idea of tag-mediated altruism, I thought was particularly cool, because here's how it works. The idea is, and this idea, the name tag, also comes from John Holland. The idea is that each agent has some kind of arbitrary identity. And in tag-mediated cooperation, I look at you and I decide whether or not I'm going to cooperate with you only based on the similarity of your tag and my tag. Okay? Now our tags might be similar because we're kin, or maybe not. Maybe because we're both wearing ridiculous hairdos. Okay?
Is the tag expensive?
Now the idea is the tag is supposed to model about the cheapest thing you could think of. So it could be.
So spoofing is tricky.
Well, it may be hard. It may be hard to do the spoofing, but easy to host a tag. But it may be hard to guess somebody else's.
You have a large space of possible tags.
A large space of possible tags, but
So
each tag could be as simple as the shape of a molecule or a floating point number.
You can be something, but you can't know what it signifies.
Right, well what it signifies depends on who else is out there and what their tags are, and also what their tolerances are. So the idea would be, if my tag is close to Pablo's tag, then I will donate to you. If the difference in our tags is less than my tolerance, so everybody has a tolerance for how deviant from themselves they will donate. And the idea is supposed to be that it's really cheap. It doesn't require knowing somebody's pedigree, knowing how closely related they are to you. It doesn't require knowing their history of altruism or their reputation. It's just a very simple comparison. So the idea is it could work from bacteria on a.
Is judging similarity a global thing or a personal thing? Do I judge similarity the same way you judge similarity?
In the models that I know of, yes.
That's what?
Yes, it's the same. There's a global procedure. In the models that I'm going to show you, tags are all floating point numbers between 0 and 1. And judging similarity is subtracting.
So the idea that similar genes will lead to similar tags, that's why we want to cooperate with our own tag because of the self-inclusion.
That could be what's going on. So it could be a surrogate for genotype recognition, right? But real genotype recognition would be expensive, right? We've got hundreds of thousands of base pairs, and we got to do something with our genes. Instead, we just got this one number.
could argue that that's a hash code.
Yeah,
Yeah.
could be a hash
I
value.
hang out only with Italians, you know?
You think good hash? It's interesting that it's something that could be kind of easily exploited, or not easily, but it could be exploited by the listener. So, go like a bumblebee or something. See something, it's like, I really like that bumblebee. And it turns out it's actually not a bumblebee, it's a flower. But it's...
Absolutely.
Um,
Well, some of the results I'm going to show you talk about how hard it is to spoof it or to fool it and what that leads to. Okay, so let me tell you a little of the history about this. Rick Riolo and Robert Axelrod and one other person published a paper in Nature in 2001 where they put forward this idea and they showed that in this very, very simple abstract game theory context, tag-mediated cooperation was enough to get high levels of cooperation in this game environment. Okay? And they said, look, this can really work. It's very, very simple, initiated idea of how you recognize each other can form the basis of high levels of cooperation. A year later, though, these guys, Roberts and Sherratt, produced an analysis. They said, nope, that's completely wrong. They had a bug in their code. Basically, Riolo's code said that if two guys have an identical tag, their tolerance can only go to 0, but it couldn't go negative. So even if my tolerance is 0, I'm as selfish as I can be. If we have identical tags, I'll still give to you. Okay? And Roberts and Sherratt said if you eliminate that and you let tolerances mutate to negative tiny, tiny epsilon, it's enough to destroy all the cooperation. If you can be truly selfish, if you could have a really selfish agent invade the population, cooperation goes to hell. Okay? So that's sort of a devastating sort of attack they had.
There seems to be a whole section of social theoreticians who keep going after Axelrod, which has been going after him for at least 2 decades.
Yeah, there's definitely a long-standing war. Yeah, in the game theory meets social science, and this is a little recent drama.
and there are also lots of people who support his work, right?
Well,
They have a similar tag.
So John and I actually looked at this, and actually I don't remember exactly how it arose, but I remember playing around with it and playing around with some ideas and thinking, you know, it seemed like the original model was good, and probably cooperation would arise in some cases. So we made a little modification to it. First, here's a schematic diagram of what I already told you, I guess. But the way the model works to make it completely explicit is, it's not drawn the right way there. You have in fact, basically a collection of these agents. Each agent just is. It's nothing else than a tag and a tolerance. Okay? And what you do at each time step is everybody gets a couple shots to pick a random guy and donate. But they'll only donate if the guy they pick has a tag within their tolerance of their own tag. Okay? After they all do that, they all you look at who the guys are who are have the most energy, the stuff they're donating around, and the guys who have the most, it's actually done in tournaments, the guys who have relatively a lot of energy get to make babies, and there's mutation. Okay?
They start with a uniform amount each.
What's that?
They start with a uniform.
Yeah, they all start with it.
Are the donations conserved?
That's a very interesting thing. In the standard model, they're not. They're rather dramatically not. And the way they rationalize it is it's something like alarm calls in nature. So an alarm call, I have a relatively small energy expenditure and a relatively small additional risk of predation by yelling, there's an eagle coming, right? But there's a really big benefit to my fellow who gets not eaten because I gave the alarm.
So it's a free software model.
What's that?
A free software model.
Yeah, I guess so. It's a free to lunch. Yeah, so basically the way, the ratio that we used, that they all used and that we used for some of this is that I get charged 0.1 and the person I donate to gets 1. Okay? So
Pretty dramatic.
it's not conserved. We did something though where we made it equal, and we still got cooperation. But let me get there. All right. So here are the tweaks that we made. We said, all right. So Robertson Surratt showed the thing falls apart if you can be truly selfish. What if we add one or two other things to the model? Can we rescue the evolution of cooperation? And so we looked at adding two things. One is genetic stability. We looked at their mutation rate that Riolo used and then Robertson Surratt used, and it's really, really high. So we said, well, maybe that matters. Let's play with the mutation rate. And then we looked at one other thing, which is spatial structure, which there was none in the other one. So anybody could donate to anybody, and anybody, then, and also the reproductive tournaments were with anybody. Okay? And we said, okay, let's put them all in a linear array with a wraparound, and we'll say you have a limited interaction radius, which we can vary. Okay? If your interaction radius is 1, you can only donate to and receive donations to your immediate neighbors. If it's 10, you got 10 on this side, 10 on that side, and also when you do reproductive tournaments, it's within this radius. Okay? So we looked at those two things, and here's the result.
What was the boundary condition?
What's that?
What was the boundary condition? At the two ends of the linear line.
Oh, it wraps.
It's a ring.
It's a ring. Okay.
Because you could dissipate the stuff donating out the edge of the flat world.
Good. We just modded the index by the array length, right? So they were all in an array anyway, so it was, a very quick change. All right, so here we've got mutation rate varying along the this way, and interaction radius that way. And you see that little spot with R and S. This is the condition they were looking at. Okay? And this is all with allowing pure selfishness, allowing the negative tolerance. So when you do it there, you get basically no donation. This is how the donation rate, how cooperative guys are being after running for a long time and letting evolution do its thing. Okay? So they pretty much were in the absolute worst region of the space, right? Doing anything with limiting geography so that you have some sense of a radius of interaction, you get a lot more. And doing anything with a lower mutation rate, you're using a mutation rate of 1 in 10, right? Anything with lower mutation rate, you also get more cooperation. And if you do both, lower the mutation rate a little bit and decrease the interaction rate, you can get a lot, a huge amount of cooperation. So our conclusion there is, in fact, the simple model of tag-mediated cooperation really does work. Tags really do provide a strong foundation for the evolution of cooperation, and their rebuttal of the Riolo paper was based on this one point parameter space, which those are perfectly reasonable parameters. There was no justification for the
How many different parameters did Riolo and Hampshire use?
None. I mean, they use, as far as I know, all that's published. When I talked to Riolo about this, they just picked those out of a hat, and that's what they used. And it worked for their model. And then when Robertson Surratt tried it and went to negative tolerances, it didn't work.
It's just hard to believe that those are nature papers.
Yeah, they're nature papers.
We thought it was hard to believe too. Furthermore, we thought it was hard to believe that this paper did not get into Nature, which showed up both those papers and said
it didn't get in.
These problems.
This has appeared in Artificial Life like this
I read
year.
this paper. It was one of my favorites in that journal. So.
Yeah, we sent it to Nature 2 years ago, and they didn't like it, and then we kicked it around, and now it's in Artificial Life. So anyway, so that's that story. Okay.
What do they like about it?
I want to tell you one more piece of. Two more pieces on this story before we move on to the 3D agents. One is that so that shows conditions under which cooperation can evolve using this very simple tag mechanism. John and I thought, well, maybe those conditions under which it can evolve, under which cooperation can evolve, are also conditions under which adaptive complexity would better evolve. And so we did something very simple that has a lot of other history in the evolutionary computing literature. There's a lot of work in genetic algorithms and genetic programming using spatial models, where there is where individuals inhabit a space and they can only mate with those nearby, and so on. The phrase deems is often used for these models. There are actually quite a range of them that have been tried in the literature. What we did is, since we were so happily surprised that that really simple idea of this one-dimensional geography worked so well in the game theory situation, we said, well, let's try that in genetic programming, which is an area we were working in anyway. And the startling thing was that what can be done pretty much in one line of code being changed in the genetic programming system produced major improvements in problem-solving capability of our system on a bunch of different problems. And it's a very simple technique. It's so simple we call it trivial. We call it trivial geography. The idea is you simply, people have done much more complicated things where they have subpopulations and different ways of moving things from subpopulation to subpopulation and so on. We just said, make your population in a genetic algorithm, genetic programming system in our case, which is already in this one-dimensional array. Just do a modulus operator every time you go to get somebody for anybody to interact with. So the guys with whom you can interact with for finding a mate, for doing a crossover, are within a radius of you in that array. And same thing for doing reproductive tournaments. When you're trying to figure out who gets to make a baby for this location, just look in that little neighborhood. They're overlapping neighborhoods, okay? And it turns out it works so well that I see no reason why everybody shouldn't always do it, because it's so simple. So that was a little spin-off of this, but it got some gears turning about connections between the evolution of adaptive complexity and the evolution of cooperation. I'm not sure what the connections are based on that, but there seems to be some fertile interactions.
It just reminds me of something and I'm trying to remember which Israeli mathematical psychologist did this, but there were papers on showing that when you run neural networks in a sort of synchronous fashion, like Rummel-Hoffman-McClellan interactive activation network, DSP, everybody, fully mixed, everybody gets all the inputs, they update, boom. You can get very coherent, and fairly complex oscillatory behaviors out of that. But if you relax it a little bit, and you start doing it in a way that's, say, slightly asynchronous, all the structure that was due to your use of the clock, so to speak, goes away. So, by putting GP on a ring, by putting GP on a ring, instead of essentially a fully mixed population, you might be, sort of introducing, some selection artifact, so to speak, by that locality.
Yes, well, I'm sure you are. And then there's synchronization issues because things travel in waves.
Is it
you can watch them, you can watch them traveling around, and you get some very complicated, interesting behavior, which would just totally fall apart when you can't mix the population.
Is it a kin selection artifact? Because when you, in the GP algorithm, when you self-replicate, do the replicants,
they land near the parents.
They land near the parents. So is it a kin selection artifact?
It probably is. So,
Interesting.
but that's what you get from geography.
Yeah, your children live near you.
And in this case, we're not using tags, but we're having local populations.
See, my question is, I wonder if you could, if you did a well-stirred reactor version of this simulation, I wonder if you could replicate this by creating a concept of like a kin tag.
I think you may be able to, but and there is stuff in the literature of doing that. Where you do this diversity.
I mean, it might not be programmatically as simple. I'm just wondering theoretically.
Well, that's what I think the beauty of the trivial geography.
Yeah, it's very programmatically simple.
Because people have invented very clever things that try to do diversity management by finding the genotypic distance and only mating with guys that are close to you in genus type space, and far from you, or a mix of those.
Right.
And there's good rationale for a lot of those things, but this is just so dirt simple.
Yeah.
It's funny because the math for like evolution evolutionary game theory, a well-stirred reactor or complete mixing. It's chosen that way probably because the math is easy.
But this is the programming.
Programming is easy.
The math might be hard to say.
Just a subtraction and a modulus, you know,
right.
It's like...
Right, the math might be hard to prove what's happening on the ring.
Right.
But I bet you could duplicate this with a well-stirred reactor and a kin tag or something like that.
That would be an interesting experiment.
Yeah.
I don't doubt it. Okay, I'm going to keep marching real quickly.
Go ahead.
You're doing sharp cutoffs for all of these criteria. Have you thought about just making it a distribution? That the closer you are...
That's a great idea.
I'm unclear
And we
why.
haven't done that. Again, this was so simple that it was the natural first step. But yeah, I think that would be a great idea to do a sort of Gaussian distribution.
Or just a linear 10.
Or even a linear one, right. That you're more likely to pick the guys who are closer to you. I think that might be better.
That works. That should work better.
Yeah. That's definitely worth trying.
Less trivial.
Well, but less trivial. We wouldn't have had the title. So, we always start with the acronym, and then the title.
It's LT, less trivial.
The last thing on the game theory models, it addresses this issue which several of you raised about spoofing. So this is actually definitely John's idea. This one. We were looking at why and when the tag-based stuff seemed to work better in the altruism model, in the game theory model. Thank you. And we actually made little animations showing who was donating, and we had these little things going. You could see where the cooperators were, what their tolerances were, and watching it go. And then we were trying to figure out if you had a bunch of cooperators, how could it break down? Because if you mutate to cooperation, well, first of all, how could it persist? And then how could a defector, which means a guy who's going to be selfish, how does he come in and exploit the system? Okay? And John's analogy was that with tags, becoming a defector and exploiting the system is like guessing a password. Okay? These systems are too stupid to be able to like look at the tag and copy it because they don't have a program. There are just tags and tolerances. But if mutation caused it to essentially guess the password, guess the tag of some nearby cooperators, then it could start exploiting those cooperators, getting energy from them without sharing itself. Okay? So then the idea, John's idea was, well, if you have longer passwords, it should be harder to mimic. It should be harder to break in. It should be harder for a defector to break in. So that led to the idea of multi-dimensional tags, which is the same idea as the original one, but instead of having one floating point number, you have n floating point numbers. Okay? So your tag is now n floating point numbers, and your distance is now Euclidean distance in n-dimensional space. And what we found out was that essentially, as you raise the number of dimensions, you get more and more cooperation. Why? Because the same mechanics allow cooperation to start. But once it starts, the higher the dimension of the space, the harder it is for defectors to invade. Okay? So having a higher dimensional tag space gets you more and more evolution of cooperation. Okay? Bunch more graphs of that. I'll skip. All right. So now I want to switch gears, and I'll start talking slower. So how does this apply to like more interesting A-life systems? Because that is so far is a very emaciated, it's a good test tube, right? It's a very emaciated kind of system that nobody actually cares about. These agents that just consist of tags and tolerances, and all they do is play this donation game, right? So what about in a more complex, richer environment? What are the relations between altruism and evolution? When does it arise? When doesn't it? What I really want to get back to is how does altruism or cooperation then influence evolution? Okay? So we're looking at multi-agent systems, and this line of research starts with a simple swarm system implemented in Breve, which you should all know that, John's Breve system. And there we have swarming Breve logos. And they're following a standard Craig Reynolds inspired swarming algorithm in which each agent determines its acceleration as this linear sum of a bunch of vectors determined from the world that are weighted. Okay? So you have a vector pointing away from other guys that are near you and crowding you, and you can decide how much you care about that. And you have a vector towards the world center, and you decide how much you care about that. And so any setting for the system is a bunch of those weights, P1 through P5. Notice P5 is multiplying a random vector, so P5 is big, you get pretty crazy gnat-like swarming. P5 is really low, you'll get very coordinated behavior. So,
are these allowed to be negative?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Well, in the general model, they can be. But in the evolutionary work that I think Lee's going to talk about, no, they can't.
So, but I think that answer implies more play needs to be done to find out what will happen if you just crank one of those negative.
Well, I guess
it's
the same as
antisocial behavior.
Yeah.
Right.
If they're real negative, it would be the anti-swarm.
Yeah, you would essentially have if P4 was negative, you'd be having a component of your acceleration that's away from the world center.
Right.
Yeah, it seems reasonable. But I think in the implementation, we don't have it. I'm not 100% sure. Okay. So if you download Breve and play with the demos, there's a whole bunch of different versions of Swarm that are built in there, and they do cool stuff. And you can change those weights, right, and get very different behavior. This is just one that I played with. So it started doing that, okay? So you get a really rich bunch of behavior out of it. So the first thing that I did with this, actually when I was first starting to play with Breve, is I made an evolutionary version of it where I just took the standard swarming system and I added 2 more components, okay? And these components referred to others within a group. So I had, as you'll see, 3 hard-coded species, okay? With 3 different colors, and you know about where the guys are in your species and where the guys are in other species, right? And your vector has your swarming equation has 2 more components. Well, actually, one of them is away from other species. So if there's a bunch of guys from other species around you, you can want to get away from them, okay? Or not, depending on what your constant is. I guess if it was a negative acceleration. Yeah.
The acceleration of one of these birds is essentially, I guess it's 3-dimensional X, Y, and Z, right?
Yeah.
And all you do essentially is move it a little bit, and it has a current heading and a current velocity, and you just change it to velocity. So it's like a video game.
Yep.
Car.
Yep.
3D.
Yes. And then I also, to make evolution happen, I had to have an energy source on which I could do selection, okay? So I made these energy sources, which you'll see are these disks that float around. And if you intersect with one of them, you get energy, okay? And if your energy goes to 0, you die. And what happens in this model, if you die, is a new guy of your species is created in the place right where you were, okay? But its genotype comes from this best guy of your species, where best is age times energy, okay? Right? And your genotype is just your weights, okay? And they all start out with random genotypes, and then you see what happens.
Does that give you energy? The new guy have energy?
The new guy in this system, there is not conservation of energy in that
You
sense.
can manufacture energy by killing people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The best strategy is to die fast.
Well,
So
there's
they'll
an
all turn
interesting
into
thing
Nazis.
that happens. That's not the best strategy for you to propagate your genes. If your genes are suicidal, you'll be helping everybody else by dying. but your genes will not be propagated.
So even though there are these different species, there's actually, in a sense, competition within the species to be the best of that group.
To be the guy
live
who gets
longest.
to get its genotype with possible mutations stuck in the body of the next guy who dies.
You're just thinking about two clauses, one which.
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing. The fact that the ones who do die can't pass on their genes. You almost want to see a situation where like some of them benefit and like kind of devise the strategy for getting other ones to shed their lives.
Well, that's what happens.
You have the,
There we go.
you have the, if you allow 1.0, right, or 0.999 to mutate, wrapping around to 0.0, then you can get like a species that, you know, has the best with a value of 1.0, you know, each energy mutates into 0.0, who is suicidal.
Aha, that would be very interesting. That's very interesting. So one of your vector components is right on the boundary condition.
Right.
That would be a really cool thing to look at.
Manifestation.
Yeah, so you could use that to make arguments about like the evolution of psychosis. Or,
Something like that.
So this is an artificial set of three species that are colored.
purple, red, and blue.
Yeah, you could have used yellow instead of purple. And
Sorry.
and basically, so it's within those species, like what Carl said, the arbitrary groupings of genomes. Right?
Yes. Well, within those species, all of the agents at the beginning are random genomes.
Right.
Okay.
But they're identified. They're also identified with a.
But each guy has a color using one of the three species.
But I totally missed the cooperation.
Well, okay. By the way, this is in a sequence of systems. The next one, you'll see something more significant. But what I want you to see in this one is that, well, first of all, the three species do evolve very different behaviors. In particular, those purple guys are very well coordinated, and they will slowly go in. Okay. There, it just restarted. The feeders move around, and the red guys are the best at getting there first, but they're pretty uncoordinated, and the purple guys always eventually push them out. Okay?
Do you deflect the other guys, or?
No, well, it's a component of their vector. They can decide how much they want to run away from them.
So your opponents are
there's an
only-
energy cost to colliding
Yeah.
with
thank you.
opponents, which I'm not sure you mentioned.
Yeah, I did. That is important. But here's the critical thing. You get this evolved behavior where right now that purple cloud has monopolized, well, did for a moment there, monopolized that feeder. And what's going on in those moments is some of the guys are in the middle, feeding. And the other guys on the outside of the cloud are dying. Getting reborn, dying. Getting reborn. So where are they getting their genotypes from? From the guys in the middle. Okay? So this is what you guys were talking about, where the guys on the outside, I think the way to think of it is that it's really like an organism, these species, where the guys on the outside are like the defensive organs, or the skin, or something like that. They're repelling the red guys, okay, and dying. So it looks like altruism, right? But it's for the benefit of the guys in the middle who are replacing their genotypes to the outside. So you have like reproductive organs on the inside, and some kind of digestive and reproductive organs on the inside, and peripheral agents or something like defensive organs. Okay. Now, well, I want to go right to the more complicated system because this I think you could the lessons you can draw about higher level organization I think are good. The ones about cooperation, it's a little tricky to make the case well because of this issues about non-conservation of energy and because of this issue about the fixity of the species. Okay? So let's go right to this next system. This system, imaginatively called Swarm of All 2, has a radically different architecture. We still have these little arrows-like things flying around in space. There's still feeders that they get energy from. But in this case, we have conservation of energy. We also have completely open-ended behavior on the part of the agents. So no longer are they controlled by a swarm equation. These guys are controlled instead by arbitrary computer programs. Okay? And there's also no pre-existing species distinction. They're all just guys, okay? They could decide to organize themselves, or organization can emerge, but there's no predetermined idea of species. And each one has within it an arbitrary computer program that determines its behavior, okay? That behavior includes what direction to head to, just like in the first swarm evolve system, but it also includes how to make babies, okay? So they can decide to make offspring, and when they do make offspring, they can decide what program those offspring should have. It could be a version of its own program. It could be a recombination of its own program and somebody else's program nearby. They can access the programs of neighbors. So the reproductive behavior and the flying and everything about what they do is determined by these arbitrary computer programs that are in their guts.
So how does the energy sharing work?
And in the instruction set of this program are several instructions that allow giving energy to a neighbor.
Can you? Okay, so it's got to be within the immediate vicinity.
Within the immediate vicinity, there's
Okay.
a radius within which you can interact with each other.
When they reproduce, you hand energy off to get some value.
Yes. Yes. And you lose exactly that much energy, actually plus a little bit.
Does the radius can different?
They all have the same radius.
All the same. Okay.
That's a preset.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, but see, energy sharing in bright red there, that's because in this case there's an explicit thing of giving away energy. And so that gives us something much more concrete to track.
Is that what the instruction set looks like, or?
I don't have a slide for it here. It's implemented in my push language, and I don't have it with me.
Just Google push GP and you'll find it.
In the paper on it, this is a quick slide about push, which I'm not going to really talk a lot about, but it's a stack-based language, and there are instructions in there for a lot of normal stuff like math and list manipulation. Notice there has to be list manipulation stuff because you have to be able to make the programs for your babies. So that's list manipulation and access to your own code. But then also thrown in there is a handful of other instructions for stuff that's specific to moving, changing your direction, and sharing energy and stuff. All right, so here's a little bit of action in this. So the feeders changed into these spheres, and they have a finite amount of energy which grows back. Okay, that energy is conserved within the system, although they grow back, I guess, from the sunlight or something like that. Now, what you've just seen here is the emergence of reproductive competence. In this system, because they have to make their own babies, random programs aren't even smart enough either to go to the feeder or to make babies. So you have to run it for a long time till something randomly arises that's smart enough to go to a feeder and then execute a spawn instruction and give it a program and have that spawn guy be smart enough to go to a feeder and so on, okay? And that take a couple thousand iterations or something, okay? And so I just showed you the bit of the movie there where it, let's do that again, where this random guy is being created until something, that guy there goes to the feeder, and no, it wasn't him. Somebody arises shortly here who's smart enough to go to a feeder and then make babies. You see that? There you go.
It takes a couple thousand.
It takes a while.
Wow.
And that's just combinatorics of the instruction set.
Yeah.
Right? How long it takes till something gets done.
With the nanopond talk I did here a while back, you saw basically the same thing except in a simpler system where you had the emergence of self-replication and then interesting stuff started to happen.
Great. So now, look how small all the feeders are. Now there's real competition for those resources, and then you start getting real selection. So with the energy sharing, we saw some really cool stuff evolve. And actually, let me show you this movie first. This was a particular run, and you see the corpses falling there. Corpses are inert, that's just for a visual thing. These guys evolved this really weird behavior, but it's all based on sharing. When a guy goes and feeds in this system, he immediately makes a bunch of babies and shares all his energy with all of them. Okay? So here, this was the chunk of code that was the core of the behavior. essentially it says, go straight for the code. Don't give a damn about who else is around you, who's in your way. I would go straight for the feeder. When you get to the feeder, immediately feed everybody around you and turn a random color. Okay, that's why we see all this flashing. Now the feeding instructions are tag tolerance based. Okay, so you specify the tag and tolerance that you're going to feed, that you're going to share with. Okay, and in this case, what you're seeing as the color is the tag. The tag is visually represented as a color. In this case, they're sharing with, if I remember this correctly, anybody who has a different color than you. So this is the way that it ends up being. And so turning random colors means you're going to get fed by people who have that strategy. Okay? So it's a sort of bizarre thing. Here's, you can do lots of cool things in Breve, just to show that off. Anytime any two guys have shared, you show them connected with a line so you can see how that grows. But it turns out it didn't teach us too much, even though it looked cool. Here's some actual data that shows when it's good to share in this world. Again, following up on the earlier ideas that the environment matters. How likely you are to be next to your kin matters, right? Things about the stability of the environment matter for how good it is to share. And what this shows, that top line, the solid one, the squares, is one kind of sharing, which is actually, we tried a bunch of different kinds of sharing as controls. This one will share, but only if the guy who you're going to share with is known to have shared. So it's a little bit of a mixture between pure tag-based sharing and reputation-based sharing.
Which one is that? I'm sorry.
The top line, the solid with the squares.
Gotcha.
Okay. And that dotted line is when the sharing operator is a no-op. Okay. So some of the very costly forms of sharing, we tried this thing called charity sharing. That's, you give it away no matter what the other guy does. No, actually, the very bottom one is waste sharing. Waste sharing, you give it away and it doesn't even get to the guy you're giving it to. It's just lost. Okay? That's very bad, and as expected, you don't see a lot of attacks. Okay? But the kind that is costly, but is based on tags and based on this minimal element of reputation, namely, don't give to a guy who's never given to anyone. Okay. Actually, never tried to give to anyone. That, it turns out, shows up in certain kinds of environments reliably much higher than the no-ops.
So I'm confused. Are these guys, if these guys are evolving their own programs, how does it that would you inject your own program in on top of that? Sharing.
Now they're evolving their own programs, and what we changed as different experimental conditions is what the share operators do. So in one condition, the share operator basically burns the energy. And in another one, it transfers it no matter what. And in another one, it transfers it only if the guy you're transferring it to has ever tried to share. Okay? But it's the same instruction set in any
Isn't that a
case.
form of tag? Whether you've ever shared or not is behavior, and behavior is dependent on your nature. So you've got a tag which happens to...
I guess you could think of that as a tag, but I think of a tag as an identifier rather than a history.
This is an identifier.
It's closer to reputation than to tags.
But this is a way of tagging a group. It's a way of grouping them into an equivalence class of similar things rather than tags being
But the tag is sort of genetically fixed,
So
whereas
sharing.
in this case the sharing is a behavioral thing which depends on the program. So something can be more.
Of your genome.
Well, but that's like saying me giving to charity is a tag of my genome.
Yes, it describes that you have a certain...
Well, if you take that interpretation, then yes.
I'll just keep saying it until...
Okay, so that's another tag. But I think it's a behavior. Right. This is actually my last cool animation. I'm not going to say a lot about it, except for something that I've been working on now for the last 3 years or something, is to try to take those ideas about a bunch of things, but including how resource flows contribute to the evolution of adaptive complexity. And essentially what you saw in that swarm evolve 2 thing, where you're evolving open-ended behaviors and moving it into a multicellular kind of...
Is this all in Brevity?
This is all in Brevity. Very impressive system. Recommend people try it.
Except please disregard the blocks flying away in the first animation.
The first animation, I love that animation, but what it is a demonstration of a physics project.
That's the same one that Sim System. Whenever
the one in the
system
upper
was
left?
very good at discovering physics bugs.
Yeah. Well, what's happening here is it's getting a whole lot of energy out of nowhere because the thing, when it folds up itself, it's self-penetrating, and then the physics engine says, "Oh, you can't be there. You should be here." And then,
you know,
a little tweak to get rid of penetration.
I want to create. I'm sorry. I want to correct what was just said. The physics engine is good at discovering bugs. That's not true. The physics engine is good at illustrating bugs for the human programmer.
Okay.
Okay. Which is the same mistake that Wolfram made. Because it was his eyeball that pulled out the interesting automata. It wasn't the automata itself.
All right. Well, I think I really like that. See, watch when the guy goes flying up, you see him coming back down, way in the back. It just has a certain lyrical quality. So it goes up, and now it's way in the back. Right? So that was actually an early test of some of the ideas, and then you see 3 other versions of it. The one in the lower right is what I'm working on right now. I think that was generated a day or 2 ago.
Could you actually explain a little bit about what we're seeing in each of these tiles? I mean, I guess we got a little bit of the first one. It's where we're saying what